Good afternoon. So to give you a little bit about what the agenda will be, because we're, I think, pressed for time, I'm going to give you an introduction to this ministry that's happening with the Antiochians and is now being offered to all jurisdictions. Then we're going to watch a clip of a new film that's about 12 minutes long. I'll explain how we're using this film and the different aspects that looks like, the history of what we've been doing with Becoming Truly Human, and then hopefully have time for questions, some Q&A at the end. That's what I've planned on. So once again, to introduce myself, my name is Adam Lowell Roberts. I do work for the Antiochian Archdiocese full-time. This is my full-time position. And Becoming Truly Human is an outreach ministry. And we've chosen those words selectively for a couple of reasons. So I want to explain the title in full and what the outreach ministry is. Then I'll explain the structure of it, and then we'll get right into the film. So it's going to be moving along rapidly. I don't think you'll have a chance to fall asleep. You might, but I don't think that will happen. So in terms of outreach ministry, this was definitely began back in 2009 with a gentleman out on the West Coast who was looking for how to give some more resources to our parishes that wanted to grow both spiritually and numerically. Not just numerically, because numbers does not mean that we have a healthy parish. But so we wanted to see, is there something out there that would help a church grow both spiritually and numerically together? And after a number of years of research and development, this was officially born at the end of 2013 under Metropolitan Philip. We launched in 2014 in a pilot phase to start testing what had been developed in local parishes, and we're now about to release this month. We are releasing, actually, I keep forgetting we're in November, the official materials of this culmination that began in 2009 and became official in 2013. And what this looks like, this outreach ministry, came out of us realizing that when we're having casual conversations about the Orthodox faith, there's actually more of a language barrier than we realize with the rest of America. When we use words like truth, or a new word on the scene is gender, when we say pray, when we say God, we have a different definition. When we say saint, we have even a different definition than most of Christianity, and even what the Catholics, how they would define what their saints are. And so because of this, it's getting harder and harder to explain in an American way what the Orthodox faith is, how old it is, what it means to be an Orthodox Christian. And so we just started discovering that if we were going to empower churches to grow both spiritually and numerically, that we had a large language barrier, and we needed to give some materials to the churches that helped them overcome this language barrier. And what ended up happening was we found an Orthodox filmmaker who's filmmaker first and became Orthodox after he was a filmmaker. And he had only made one feature film, but he had already won some accolades at some film festivals. And through a series of, I will say, miracles, because if I tell you the whole story, you're like, that shouldn't have happened, that shouldn't have happened, that shouldn't have happened. We were able to hire him in a joint effort with the Archdiocese to create the first American-made Orthodox feature film. Now, there are a number of Orthodox films that have been made throughout the world. This is not the first Orthodox film, but it's the first one made in America, in English, that relates to the American culture and the intersection between the Orthodox faith and America. So it's a very interesting film. The way it plays into the ministry is that what we knew early on we wanted to do is we wanted to start providing more hospitality. We wanted to connect our parishes with their local communities. We knew we wanted to give them something that was Orthodox to think about and talk about in a way that they could understand, that was in context. Similar to the way when St. Paul was on Mars Hill, he knew who his community was, and he started with very specific information. He said, I want to talk about the God that you talk about, that I saw, okay? So he knew who his community was. He knew who the culture was. And we've seen this throughout history of our great missionaries. St. Patrick knew who the Irish were when he went to talk to them. He knew their culture. He knew their beliefs. St. Innocent did this in Alaska, right? And so what we realized was there's this gap of how much we don't know about America because we're in our churches and they're not. And so learning more about the millennials, learning more about this, what's become the larger demographic that we've been studying is the nuns and the duns. Nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not like in a monastery, but the nuns and the duns. And you'll hear more about this in it, and they explain it. But basically, these are people that used to check off a religion in a survey. Which religion are you? And they would check one of them. These nuns and duns are now the second largest religious group in America, comprising 25% of America. And so the language barrier is not only is it getting harder, but that group of people in that is getting larger and is growing rapidly. So we had to figure out how do we give them something to talk about. And then we also wanted to help empower our lay people on doing a better job of talking about the Orthodox faith, and which is hard for us when it's so different than what America's used to in terms of Christianity, right? I mean, we say Christianity, and you know all of the different things they're thinking through their head in terms of American Christianity. You're like, no, you have to wipe the slate clean, and we got to start fresh. And so that's why we wanted to make the film. And most of my job is going into parishes and teaching different people how to host the discussion groups. And that's really how this plays out. Usually you watch the film over a series of 4 to 6 weeks in chapter segments. And each week you're starting with a little bit of hospitality, maybe meal. Then you watch a chapter of the film, and then you talk about it. And there's a very peculiar way that we talk about the film. And that's the last thing I'll say before we watch the next 12 minutes. And I'm going to put this little question in you. At the end, I'll give out my business cards for anybody who's interested. But on the back of our business card, probably the ethos of the discussion group, this question. How many questions did Jesus directly answer in the Gospels? And what you start to find out is that we've been doing a Roman model of evangelism in America, and somehow we've abandoned our rich history of Eastern evangelism that St. Patrick did, St. Innocent did, St. Cyril Methodius. And I'm going to talk more about that after we watch this first chapter of the film. So right now we will get started. Do you mind turning the lights off?
I know what's good and bad. I have my own set of standards, but when it comes to checking those, it's usually done with family.
My name is Christian, and I identify as a nun, but in that category, I would say I'm agnostic.
Regardless of what exists or doesn't exist in the supernatural realm or the religious realm, the thing that I keep coming back to in my life is how much sense love makes. I am Tyler, and I don't know what I am religiously.
I do consider myself spiritual. The way it manifests for me is just in my gratitude for all things in my life. My name is Laura, and I'm not religiously affiliated.
We are the universe being self-aware of the universe. It's like really kind of cool that, you know, the universe made you and you're self-aware that you were made. I think almost magical kind of thing.
My name is Joshua, and I do not currently have any religious affiliation.
I think I lost faith in all of it. I don't personally want to. It kind of makes me sad that I did. I'm sad because I want to believe there's something.
My name's Tiffany, and I'm not sure what my religious affiliation is. I believe that there's a higher power that might have influence on certain things that happen, like that everything happens for a reason, that there's like certain coincidences. Well, my name is Emily, and I guess technically I'm Catholic, but I don't really associate with that very much anymore.
I would say it all boils down to the golden rule. Seems pretty straightforward to me.
My name is Eric, and no, I do not have a religious affiliation.
When considering doing this film, I can't tell you how many times I thought about walking away. It's terrifying to put yourself, your journey, your experiences, your failures out there to be judged. The temptation, at least for me, is to bulletproof your life, to craft a facade for the outside world. Maybe it's someone who's trendy or successful. Maybe of a great parent or an intellectual, even a saint. there's something incomplete, if not false, in saying to the world, I'm whole, I'm corrupted, even happy. I will have been misunderstood if anyone hears that in my story. I'm not whole, I'm far from uncorrupted, and I'm certainly no saint. In a word, I'm not yet fully human, but I want to be. I'm Basil, and I am no longer religiously unaffiliated.
Growing up, I definitely went to church. Early memories. I remember going with my grandparents and my parents. They both went to the same church. I found out later on that it was more like my mom's idea. My dad was like, well, I did my thing. I'm not going to go to church with you guys anymore. So for a while, it was just my mom and then my brother and my sister. We would go Sundays. When I was in probably the middle school age, I was super much Christian. I believed in God. I don't know, my sophomore year, I definitely would not have openly told anyone that if I still went to church, which I did, but not super frequently. But we would have debates in class, and they're like, I know the answer for my church is that this is wrong, or that I should side this way, but I would never take that conservative line. It just didn't resonate with me. And then I started kind of more questioning, well, if I don't think that's right, what else do I not agree with in this religion? The certainty to uncertain questions, where there's questions you can't answer, like what happens when you die, or why are we here? And no one has real answers about that, but they did kind of parade around like they knew. Like we have this book that has all the answers in it, and it's like I read through that book a little bit, and I didn't really find any answers. Without that certainty, it just kind of faded really quickly. I mean, as a scientist, I could never say that God doesn't exist, because I can't prove that. But, I err on the side that it doesn't seem likely, and I've never seen anything that would show me that such a power does exist. Something could happen that might change for me to believe in God, but I think it would have to be some sort of scientific evidence. Because it's not like I wouldn't have to see God or Jesus. They wouldn't have to descend from heaven for me to believe, kind of thing. Because I deal with stuff all the time that I can't see or touch or taste. I can't see molecules, but I measure them all the time. So just something measurable. Sign me up for whatever religion is associated with that measurable God.
The main thing that I think of when I think of my dad, childhood memories of my dad, probably two things: cigarette smoke and hard work. I love my dad, I still do, but he was really a mystery to me. I knew what my mom believed about the world and about God and things like that, My dad, not so much. I knew what he thought about unions and politicians, but but not so much about God or the meaning of life or anything like that. My mom was really religious. Every morning I'd come downstairs and she'd be in the same beat up leather chair with a Bible in her lap praying. And she really did live out what she believed. You know, our family was used to going to church every Sunday. Religious upbringing for a lot of people means don't ask any hard questions, don't question. Whereas in my house, the only two things you would talk about were religion and politics. It was probably due to my upbringing that I learned to really love difficult questions. It's also probably one of the reasons that atheism was really never something I strongly entertained. In those environments, I'd already heard arguments against the existence of God. I had heard proofs for the existence of God. I had heard atheistic interpretations of science, theistic ones. It was always seemed more plausible to me that the world derives its existence from something else, something God-like, that's sufficient to produce everything else. That's something I always came back to. God was something that really connected with me and stirred something in me, whereas religion didn't. I just didn't get the point. My mom was a Lutheran. You know, for Lutherans, it's really big that, you know, they don't want you to get too hung up in rituals or good works or something like that. They see some of that as too Catholic. And so there's always an emphasis on personal, you know, faith. But one of the things that always raised for me was the question of, well, why do any of the religious stuff in the first place? And my mom was, well, she was pretty good at being able to engage in argument and discuss hard questions. When it came to the question of why practice religion, those questions she was much less able to answer.
41 Alpha, take 1, common mark. We are rolling.
There's this phenomena across the country, particularly noticed by folks who do polling and things like that, of nuns, right? So in the 90s, the number of folks who in religion surveys would answer none of the above in terms of religious affiliation was only around 5 to 7% tops. Whereas by 2015 it had risen to 25%. And that really caught some folks' attention. And who are these? Well, what do we call them? And that's where the term arose, nuns, since they identify as none of the above, religiously speaking. And so you all represent a sampling of that group. So here you are, the nuns, welcome. My first question is really just the general question of religion itself. When you hear the word religion, right, what sort of things come to mind?
When I hear religion, I instinctively hear kind of like structure. To me, it's very much this rigid box that you either are inside or outside.
Okay.
It's interesting that you speak of rigidity, and I tend to think of fluidity. I'm fascinated by religion, and I'm fascinated by the various manifestations of it. So much variety. It feels like opportunities rather than, limitations, I guess.
Okay.
I more so think like rules, because every religion kind of has a goal. Like Christianity is to get into heaven, Buddhism is to reach nirvana. So it's always kind of like a way to get there.
Whenever like the first word pops in my head, just religion, I kind of like brace myself because everybody has their own like certain opinion on it, and some people are more like gung-ho about it, and some people are more biased towards it. So
Now, what are the two things you don't talk about?
Politics and religion.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, that's right.
Bring that lights up. I'm sure you probably already have questions, and I promise we will get to them, so try to remember them. So, in case you hadn't noticed, it's a documentary, which means there's no actors, there's no fiction. This is a real story. This is Basil's real story. I like to say Basil, but if he's going to call himself Basil, we'll respect that. And so the film has 3 components, and you see most of that through each of the chapters. Like I said, there's 5 chapters. One component is Basil's story. The second component blended with that are individual interviews with these nuns, and we saw Joshua first. And then the third component is the group discussion, where he has asked them some really good questions. And you hear such an interesting variety of answers. It's real easy to think about a we-they dichotomy, that we believe this and they just don't, right? But really what you find is there's a full spectrum from one end to the other of what they believe, which makes the language barrier even harder that I talked about earlier. And how do we communicate when every nun, every spiritually unaffiliated you come across has a different belief set, a different reason they got to that point. And so we felt like one of the number of ways to begin that discussion was if they could hear someone's story. It's because our own personal stories are very valuable, very, very powerful. And so by sharing Basil's story mixed with these other stories of people that are struggling, we begin to have some content that's very rich and interesting to many people throughout America, not just the nuns, but Orthodox Christians, Protestant Christians, Catholic Christians, Buddhists. There's this wide spectrum now that are interested in this discussion. So why does this, in case you're wondering, what does this have to do with pain and suffering? Well, I will tell you what's kind of interesting. We interviewed roughly 100 nuns and before it got down to this 7. The number one topic that they struggled with and that played a part in their exiting the faith their parents brought them up with or their household was the problem with evil. That if there is good and loving God, why is there so many bad things happening to good people? And you hear a lot of it through just even the film, not including the rest of the 93 that were interviewed. And so what we're seeing is that America is hurting spiritually, that they are in pain, they are suffering, and they don't know what to do about it. And this becomes an outlet for them to find meaning in that pain and suffering. And what you start to find in these discussion groups that we're having is that more people than we realize can find value in pain and suffering, and we just don't know it. If you've ever talked to an Olympic athlete, and from a distance, we watch the Olympics, it's fun, it comes on TV, you cheer for your country. But if you've ever known an Olympic athlete, the pain and suffering they go to reach that point, and knowing what they're getting to on the other side is absolutely worth it to them. And they find value in their pain and suffering and know that if I don't have this pain and suffering, I'm not going to reach a better place. And so right there, we already have one demographic that understands something that we self-identify with. What if there's another topic on sacrificial love, on how, God is our sacrificial loving God, right? And do other people understand this outside of the Orthodox Christian faith? Well, talk to anybody that's been on the front lines in the military, who was willing to go forth for his brethren, for his country, and die with nothing expected in return. And they might not call it sacrificial love, but we find out that we're sharing the same definition. So our terminology is struggling in this language barrier, but we have a lot in common with these people that are searching. The last thing I'll say about them that we need to remember, and this is an encouragement to the Orthodox faith. This is an encouragement to all of the nuns and the spiritually unaffiliated that you know, that much of what they're rejecting, we've already rejected. They just haven't come all the way to find the faith. And what you learn in this story, and happens in a lot of America, is that they're finding us, but we're not really doing a good job of being found, right? We're kind of hidden in America. And so we're hoping with this outreach ministry to share an expression of Christianity that they don't know about, they haven't heard about, in a way that they can deeply consider and still, at the end of the day, make their own choice. We don't want anybody to feel pressured. We don't want anybody to feel manipulated. And that's why we put so much emphasis on the discussion, and that's why I do trainings to train the moderators on how to do this, which takes me to what I said right before we watched the film, about the question about how many questions did Jesus directly answer in the Gospels. And so that leads our discussions for whether it's 4, 6, or 5 weeks. During the discussions, the moderator, and truly as a moderator, if I'm the moderator, I don't answer any questions during that 4 to 6 weeks. I don't give my opinion. I don't give a comment. I don't give the Orthodox answer. And that's very hard for a lot of us to do because we feel like we finally have somebody who's interested. We need to give them the answer. Right? And so I would say, really, did this always happen? When Job was struggling with pain and suffering, and he started asking God a series of questions, God did not give him answers. He responded with a series of questions. And Job found the answer in those questions. Right? If we fast forward a little bit to Jesus' ministry on earth, does anybody remember what he said when he was asked, by what authority do you do these things?
I'll ask you a question. Tell me what you think about
John the Baptist. Right. By what authority did John the Baptist? Jesus had all the answers. He was the one man probably who had all the answers. And we get trapped in this mindset that if we can study hard enough, prepare hard enough, learn our faith hard enough, there's going to be a silver bullet answer. And yet here's the one man who had all the answers, who asked over 300 questions in the New Testament. What does it benefit God to ask a question? It doesn't. It benefits us. And we need to emulate that. We need to learn that technique, that the best way to benefit those around us is to ask them questions. And that more often than not in the beginning, we need to respond to their questions with questions because we don't have that knowledge that God has. We're not on the same boat. And so we need to incorporate that more into our language. And this discussion group does that. A couple of success stories, and then we'll move right along. For almost 2 years now, we've been having a discussion group running in St. Augustine, Florida. And the numbers go up and down because everybody's lives change. But it's been incredibly successful at imparting the faith to the community in a way that they can understand it and consider it and not feel like we've been difficult, arrogant, judgmental. It presents them to in a way that they really get to consider it on their own. And we know that we presented it. And it's been an incredible journey for that community in St. Augustine to do this. To speak about another gentleman that recently watched the film that I knew, and I didn't know about this that was happening. I've known him now for about 15 years. My wife has known him almost her entire life. And he came to a showing that I did of this and opened up that for the last several years was going through this same struggle and is now on his way back and really identified as someone who had been Orthodox for about 20 years was even starting to struggle with this problem of evil in the world. And is now finding his way back to the Orthodox faith. But this is plaguing not just America, but also our churches. It's plaguing our youth. It's plaguing so many people that you know, and we don't realize it. And the better equipped we are to handle it, to talk about it in a loving and nurturing way, and not make them feel guilty or ashamed so that they'll open up, the more of a loving impact we're going to have so they don't feel guilty. For example, learning how to hold these discussions has helped me have some deeper discussions with other people in my church. And there was one lady recently who was admitting she was struggling with the whole idea about God. And she posted it online because she was scared to come forth at our church. And I go to a rather large church. We average over 300 per week. Out of that large group, 2 of us were kind to her after she posted her struggles. Me and one other person. And sadly, it was not larger. The good news is there was the 2 of us that listened, that struggled with her, and said, yes, those struggles make a lot of sense. That what you're feeling makes a lot of sense. I don't want you to feel guilty of what you're feeling. It makes a lot of sense. She had a lot of unanswered prayers in a very difficult way. And I told her in a very non-judgmental, I can't tell you how I would act in your shoes. Because if I had gone through that, I think I would be struggling. And that has helped her stick around because we didn't push her away and told her she was believing the wrong things. So these discussions go beyond just this little ministry we're talking about in your home for 4 to 6 weeks. It starts to infiltrate your entire lives when you take on this model of answering questions with questions. The last one I'll talk about is a gentleman in California that came to one of our workshops. And about halfway through the training, he started crying. And he admitted that he had come for the next gimmick on how to get more people to their church because, he had been Orthodox for several years and they were struggling parish and he wanted to do more. And he was like, and that's how he phrased it. He used the word gimmick. What's the next gimmick I need to get more people at our church? And so he's crying, and he says, and I finally understand what it means to invite the Holy Spirit into this, that I finally understand what it means that when it says St. Paul planted the seed, that Apollos watered it, and that God caused the growth. That he finally knew how to let go of the situation and just being part of what he can control, which was how he treated others. That's all he could control, and he finally understood that in our workshop. That in our discussions, in our ministry, in the hospitality with the meal, the presentation of the film, and in the discussion, we put all the expectations on the Orthodox and none of the expectations on the non-Orthodox. How we treat them is what matters. That's the ethos throughout the entire ministry, and that's what makes it outreach. So, it is born of the Antiochians. It's available to all parishes. If you want some details, I hate having to talk details, but I know you probably do. I have business cards. I've tried to go quicker to save us time, so hopefully we now have time for question and answer. But the last thing I'll say is I'll give you a business card. It has our website. Our website is becomingtrulyhuman.com. If you want to purchase the materials and you're not an Antiochian church, we have a discount that we're running for this conference. Normally it's $397, which includes a Blu-ray and a DVD copy of the film, plus a workbook and a manual. The workbook tells you how to have the discussion group. And that's really the hardest part and the biggest part. As Orthodox, we all love the film because we have something now, a shiny new toy that we didn't have before. And it will get them interested. But what has the healing impact on them that we want is the discussion. And so that's why we have an entire workbook, and I do many trainings across the country on that. The second is the manual that tells you the overall picture of how to run this ministry in your parish, in your home. The good news for most priests that they tend to love this is they're not expected to do anything else than they were doing before because they don't want more paperwork on their desk. They're invited to be spiritual advisors as evolved as they want to be. But a lot of our parish have ready and capable lay people that can take this from beginning to end, staying in contact with the priest, letting them know what's happening. And it can be a beautiful lay-led ministry with your priest as your spiritual advisor. So the regular price is $397. It will be available, I believe, at the end of this month on Ancient Faith's website. But if you are interested, or if this sounds like something you want to do, we wanted to offer a discount to this conference. And so if you contact me within the next week, you get a discount of $297. I send you immediate provisional materials, and you get all the official stuff included with that when it comes out at the end of the month. I could talk about this for days because it's been in the making for 7 years, but that's the gist of it. And so I guess at this point maybe it would be better for Q&A. Yes, sir.
Is there anything in the film about orthodoxy explicitly?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So what ends up happening, it's about halfway through it, is right when Basil, and you learn his real story. This is not a made-up story. Right when he's ready to sign off on Christianity, he realizes he had not done really any research on the Eastern Fathers. And when he goes and he finds Athanasius, kind of by accident. And when he finds Athanasius, it changes everything. And the film ends with him joining the Orthodox Church. But he's the only one in the film. The rest of so what we did to protect the integrity of the film, his story was filmed separately from the other nuns. So they did not know during the entire shooting about Basil's story or anything about that nature because we didn't want them to be influenced. In a sense, we wanted them to be honest about their own story. So it very heavily comes on at the end. Very heavily. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
We have a group interested in maybe getting a parish started, and yet it seems that's a real tough nut to crack. We all travel about an hour to get somewhere, although there's a monastery within 20 minutes, so that's not a parish. What can we do to address, and that's your other book that I did get.
Oh, okay.
Trying to build a parish, but we're actually trying to build from ground zero. as an example, I have another Rockport church that I'm part of, and they're falling apart because some of the original founding people have, evolved to elsewhere, primarily with distance being an issue.
So I think we're just now seeing what that looks like in terms of using this to explore the possibility of having a mission. And what I recommend is, whether or not the mission happens, this will have a positive impact on the community. And so you go in with the idea of the discussion group. And what happens in week 7, like you've got, this is a very short period of time, is that you find out a lot of people want to keep this going with different films. And so we've comprised a series of films that were not made by us, but fit for this great discussion model, kind of Socratic, but not completely. Because we don't want to be completely Socratic, because the Socratic model, a lot of the things stay up here. And what we're hoping happens in this film and mostly in the discussion group is that as they're taking this information, it slowly filters down to their heart. And so we've found a number of films that we believe help do that in a follow-up sense, so that this group that's in St. Augustine, Florida, they started with the Becoming Truly Human materials, and they kept the format, and just have been putting in new presentations that relate over and over, and have grown to a very respectable size, and are trying to figure out how to branch out into a second home, because they're full in the first home, like very full. And and that's a great problem to have. So if you want to talk more about that later, I can give you my card, has my phone number and my email. I'd be happy to share with you on a more personal level, learning about your story, what that might look like. Yes?
I apologize that I missed the first 2 minutes, but I assume you didn't cover this in the first 2 minutes. So I'm totally inspired. I love it. I mean, I think often a lot of us, my church is like 10 people or 20 people on some days, and so I feel like most people in my life are not Orthodox, and how do I have these discussions? And I feel increasingly the need to have Orthodoxy part of every moment of every day of my life. It's just what sustains me, and so I love the idea of hosting something like this. But I also have 2 babies at home and a full-time job, a job that feels full-time. And so if I wanted to do this, and maybe other people in the room have this question, you get the materials, you get the handbook, and I would invite friends to my house, or what's the step 1 so that I could see this actually happening and I could put the money to actually make it?
Probably step 1 is to explore the website. And really get a full vision of what this looks like. Step 2 would be a personal conversation. The reason I work for the Archdiocese full-time is because it's amazing how different this ministry looks in different parishes and communities. And what might make sense in Atlanta or LA doesn't make sense where you are. And so my job has been, how do I make this easy and wonderful and you look forward to it every week, and not, oh my gosh, I'm glad this is over, because that was the most stressful thing, but I want to be a good Christian, but I don't think I'm doing that again anytime soon. And so, to give you some example on the range of things we've done, I've got a guy who does pizza and beer and his guy friends, and they play basketball and they eat pizza and beer and they watch it and then they talk about it. And he puts no preparation into it. Then you've got people that like to do a 4-course meal and the candlelight. And they like that. They look forward to that. And so what we do is we sit down and we talk about what would it look like, and I would ask you a series of questions, because I've seen almost, I think, the full spectrum of what this looks like in the different areas of this ministry. What would make you look forward to it every week so that it would work, for your home? And that usually requires a personal conversation, which is what keeps me busy. So, but the way you host your home group is going to be different than the way he hosts his. And that's beautiful. It's wonderful. I think, huh? What's that?
This is a joke.
Oh, okay, sorry. Lou, I think you were.
Actually, she hit on it. It was the invitation part that I was curious about, if that's incorporated in the program.
It's incorporated in the workshops that I do. So I teach about a 3-hour workshop that's mostly about how to host the discussion. And we tie this in. I'll go ahead and hopefully this will make sense. But you have to experience it before you can invite anyone to it. Okay? So if you haven't experienced it, the invitation doesn't mean anything. So Saint Fotini, the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, she experiences this man in a way that she had never experienced another man, who listens to her in a way that she had never dealt with, in probably the most bizarre conversation she's ever had in her entire life, right? It's also the longest conversation between Jesus and a person in the Bible. She takes that experience and shares that with her family and her village. And all of her brothers and sisters become saints as well. Okay? But she had a personal experience. Until you experience the discussion group, you cannot invite people to it. So I know you're thinking about, okay, how do I experience the discussion group? So we go through like a little mini model so that you can, and for some people, this happens in the workshop. So that gentleman I talked about that was crying, he had his experience in the workshop that he could invite people to, where he started to understand how to respect other people's free will. That finally clicked, that I'm going to do this the way God does it. And he was so excited about inviting other people to this opportunity of free will, that I'm going to invite you to a place where your free will is respected so much, you may not know what to do with it. Right? I mean, that's what really, and it's talked about a little bit in the film, the weight of free will, the weight of freedom, what happens with that. So that's how you invite people to it. And my job is to help get you to that point so that it's a real, genuine, authentic experience of what you're inviting someone to. I think you were next in the...
Adam, thank you. Have you ever seen this done in a college campus ministry setting?
Yes. So the first time we ran it and invited non-Orthodox was at Bowling Green, was at the college in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And we had a very interesting group come, the sampling, and one of them was an atheist. It was, I would say, overwhelmingly successful in getting them interested in this expression. Whether or not they've changed any of their beliefs, I don't know. But I do know that because of the way the discussion was handled, seeds were planted. Now, it's going to be up to someone else to water it and take that to the next step. But to give you an example of how well it went, when we do on a college campus, we recommend having the priest there as a backup, because we also recommend having the college student lead the discussion. And the priest is there because I know when I was in college, and this is talked about a lot from a psychological aspect, you're kind of half an adult and half a child, and you never know which moment is showing up, right? Which person inside of you is going to be there. So the priest is there for those moments that your child is showing up, and you're just not really sure how to responsibly host the discussion. But they can also say some very brilliant things because of those young minds, and things that you're like, that is just amazing, and I'm writing that down even though you're only 21, right? And you don't want to let them know because then they'll get a big head. So at the end of that first discussion, as they're all walking out, the atheist turned, and that first one I think was just about man. This was in the very beginning, back in 2014. We didn't have any videos yet. And the presentation was about man was made to need community. That man was not made to live apart from anyone else. And the second session was about the body having a soul. Just that, very basic elements that we can begin to discuss. And the atheist turned to the priest and said, "Thank you for this. There's not a lot of places we can go and have a great discussion like this." Brought more atheist friends. And we found out at the end why. Because he wouldn't tell us at first. But they didn't believe him when he told them about this group. Okay, now, we're in Kentucky. This is like Christian America, like, right? Bible Belt area. So tons of Christians everywhere. So they showed up to experience the same thing he showed up. And they admitted at the end, they said, well, we love going to Christian groups because we get the best arguments. Christians always argue with us. This was the first time that we had a conversation about Christianity with Christians. And they were drawn to it. And if that doesn't start to tell you the power of the discussion group, I don't know what else will, that they're drawn to talk about these things that when they're blatantly atheist. And if you don't think about it in those terms, you have to understand an atheist, a true diehard atheist, believes there is no meaning to anything ever. Everything, that even the existence of the earth is a pure accident. Our existence here. And so for them to find value in discussing man needing community, the body having a soul, and so on, is quite interesting. So, I think we had another question up here, if I remember correctly. Yes?
What age group would that apply? At what age do you do that? Would that apply to 15, 16-year-olds?
Absolutely. I'd say right around teenage years, you can start having really good discussion groups. And adding them to your discussion group can be quite interesting because they have a lot of mindsets like the nuns, even if they're coming to your church. And you'll be surprised to hear the things they're struggling with. And the sooner you can get them in a safe place to open up and talk about this, the better. For example, one of the girls that's in the film, she said she started struggling with the idea of her faith at the age of 7. And it's hard to believe a 7-year-old would struggle, but she did. And then after that came out, I was like, wow, that's amazing. And then I found out not long after that, my own daughter, who was 7 at the time, had told my wife that she was struggling with believing in God. And she's cradle Orthodox, and we're very engaged and active. And I don't know how many services we go to, and we talk about God at the dinner table, and she was even struggling. And what I started to understand is it was natural. We hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was starting to reach those reasoning years of, okay, I can't see God. I can't touch God. I don't hear God speaking the way how does this all work? And so the more we could make her feel okay about discussing it, just like Basil said, asking the hard questions and not getting in trouble, we started to see some fruit from that.
Do they need to have an Orthodox background, though?
No. I think this film appeals to all backgrounds. And this discussion model appeals to all. But I'd say some 13-year-olds, probably by 15, 16, definitely college years, absolutely. But all teenagers are kind of different levels, so some of them will love it, and some of them will think it's boring.
Well, in public schools now, you see 15-year-olds just totally lost. And
Right.
Most of them, either they don't believe in anything, or they start believing in the stars and the moon.
Right.
Stuff like that.
But they're thinking these same things already at that age.
Yeah.
And they can be thinking it. Now, they may not be ready for a group discussion. That's what they're ready to talk about it. It's just that they might not feel safe talking about it in a group discussion. So, yes.
Your emphasis in this really resonates with me because I spent most of my life as a Protestant and with a lot of apologetics and evangelism, and our method was you get really strong arguments and then you use them like a sledgehammer, and to just be able to draw alongside people and validate their questions that, hey, these are good questions that you're asking, and to have them work through it themselves. That's a very different approach to what I'm used to. And so what I wanted to ask is, do people have people who are in the nun category, do they have any suspicion of you, like, oh, this is a Trojan horse just for your church and it's going to come out in week whatever or so forth?
They do and they should, is my argument. So I just did a podcast. So, I was introduced as, I have a podcast on Ancient Faith Radio called Go Forth. It's about evangelism. That's what got me the job really with the Archdiocese, was the research I was doing and trying to understand our disconnect with evangelism and where that came from. And then that developed, and all I do are interviews. So if you haven't enjoyed listening to me, you probably will enjoy the podcast because it's not me talking. I just interview lots of interesting people. And I mean, to give you an idea of what I'm going for, my first interview was Metropolitan Callistos Ware. I want to talk about the hard stuff. And I want them to admit where we've messed up, where we're struggling, that when Christianity comes up, they sense an ambush. And that they should sense an ambush. There's a lot of emotional scar tissue in America from Christian evangelism, American evangelism. And if we don't admit that and we're not honest about that they've experienced that, then we're denying part of their life that they've gone through. I've got people in my own parish that when I was first getting into this and I explained it to them, I could see the relief, because when they heard evangelism, they almost had PTSD. Because they came from a background where you kept a list of who you've brought, before they were Orthodox. It really was traumatic. And they're not all that extreme.
How many people have you saved?
Yeah, how many people have you saved? What is your list? And you have to bring a list every week to church, of who, and how, and it's, it's very intense. And so, yes, people should feel like there's an ambush coming. I agree completely. And so one of the things we've worked hard about is to have complete transparency. Now, what gets difficult, this is where discernment comes in. So St. Paul had complete transparency when he was speaking on Mars Hill, but he was also selective in his initial information. He was honest. He wasn't hiding anything, but he was careful to make sure that he was talking in a way that would make sense, right? And that's what's difficult. And that's why, for 6 weeks, we only ask questions. We have to rebuild their trust that's gone, and it should be gone. And if we had been in the same boat, we probably wouldn't trust Christians because of the way we had been treated, right? And so we have to start with that model and understanding that there are a lot of injured people from American Christianity, and that if we don't acknowledge that, then we're not being healers for them. So there's a lot of nuances on how we do that, and we're always taking feedback on how to make sure that we're combining that transparency with that discernment. So, any other questions? Yes?
How are the priests feeling about this? I guess when my spiritual father, when we had some of this talk, like, hey, when are we going to get together and talk with people? He said, in Orthodoxy, you just don't get together and talk about religion. So it's kind of interesting. And I would say, as an Orthodox, I am less interested in trying to engage in the academic, sword fights and stuff. But I'm just curious how, in other words, does just getting him to church somehow and having him read a little, is that good enough? Or is
I would say,
a step beyond better or different? I don't know.
I would say wait as long as possible to invite them to church. Like, go the complete opposite route. Yeah. The divine liturgy was not meant as an evangelistic tool.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Okay? That's not what it's for. There's a reason that Jesus said, do not cast pearls before swine. And when you invite someone who does not have that understanding to the liturgy, how do you expect them to take it in? Now, what we don't know, here's the mystery. Every once in a while, someone will come and it just clicks, right? You don't know if they're seeking and ready for that moment or not. And so what we do is just try. If we can get enough people through the door, then it's going to stick on some of them, right? But that's not ministry in the Orthodox Church. So I just did a podcast interview about St. Patrick of Ireland with this deacon that what he shared with me just blew me away. And he wanted to do this with me because he wanted to tell me what he loved about becoming truly human. And he said the Roman model of evangelism, what failed in Ireland initially, was they went in and they did 3 things. The first thing they did was preach the message that you talked about, right? You got to hit them hard with the arguments on why this is this and this is the Christianity. If you don't accept it, you're going to hell forever, right? And then you get them to assimilate, and then number 3, you move on, and you go to the next person, and you start over, right, from town to town to town. And the first guy that went and did this in Ireland was so successful that he built 3 churches in the whole country. Okay, not really typically what we would talk about great missionary work. St. Patrick goes with a different model. He goes in first with ministry and fellowship. I'm going to minister to these people in a very human level. I'm going to fellowship with them. These will be my people in terms of I am coming to them. And if I don't start with a place of credibility, then I mean nothing to them. And until we know each other, there's no value there. So that's number 1. Number 2 is I'm going to pray for these people every day, and I'm going to pray for God's will that I know what God wants me to do for these people. Not what I want, what God wants me to do. How will I serve them? Number 3 is self-discovery and transformation. That St. Patrick knew that he hadn't arrived. It's not like he was human and they weren't. We're talking about becoming truly human. It's not like he knew he was going to heaven and he knew they weren't. He went in with humility that a relationship with these people was part of his salvation. That discovering the parts of him he didn't like and helping them find the parts of themselves they didn't like, and then transforming that, right? The 4th part is patience and preparation. That as people started to like what he was doing, he would say, okay, this takes time to solidify and submit. You can't just make these changes overnight and then they're done. right? And so for some of us, we're haunted by some of these old habits for the rest of our lives. So there's a lot of patience and preparations that we have to form in our habits. And then by natural organic process, in the end, number 5, they would choose to become Orthodox. Now, he wasn't static. He wasn't inactive. He did all these other 4 things heavily in the community. So in one sense, yes, he was passive at the end in terms of making the actual call to action and to be Orthodox. But he was very active in the other 4 areas. And so that's what we've lost. That's what's been the opposite in America. There's been heavy preaching, heavy call to action to assimilate and be a part of this community, and then they abandon you when you don't. And St. Patrick said, I will never abandon you. I will continue to serve and serve and serve Ireland. St. Cyril and Methodius went to the Slavs, failed, returned home, studied them for 7 years. You have to love someone to study them for 7 years, right? Went back, and that's when they were able to be the missionaries to the Slavs. How many of us have been willing to study someone for 7 years so that we could figure out how to share the gospel with them? Right? St. Innocent of Alaska did it for at least a year, maybe longer, depending on the historical accounts, before he shared. And by the time he started asking them to do things that didn't make sense, they did them because they trusted him. And so we have to speak from a place of credibility. And that's what we have not been doing. And that's what they're used to in American Christianity. Someone's preaching a message from without a place of credibility, and then they learn about this pastor who has this secret life, and this church leader who has this secret life, and this Christian down the street who has been chiding them for not going to church, who's having 2 affairs. You know, their words, actions, and thoughts were not unified. So, any other? Okay, so it's 3:21. If anybody needs to go, don't feel bad or rude, it's okay. But if you want to stay, I'm happy to stay until this break is over. But we had a little bit of a late start.